Okay, well, welcome everybody, and welcome to our webinar, A Resolute New Year. We're very happy to have you join us this evening, and with our wonderful guest speakers, Estrela Matilde from Fundação Príncipe and Joanna Elliot from Fauna and Flora International. I don't know whether I should wait perhaps a little bit longer or just launch into the introductions. I know that people are joining us as I'm speaking, so please welcome to all of you. And I'll start with an introduction. I am Annette Lanjouw. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Arcus Foundation, but also the Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees of Fauna and Flora International. And I'm very thrilled to welcome you today to this webinar. We've come through a challenging year this year, dominated, of course, by the outbreak of a global pandemic, but also seeing record temperatures, droughts, floods, hurricanes, fires, and other extreme weather events, and recording the highest and most dramatic losses of species around the planet, especially since the last great extinction event. There have been conflicts, population migrations, and economic losses due to many of these challenges, but also due to nations' inability to think, plan, and act together in collaboration for the good of all of humanity and for all of our planet. And for countless sentient beings, this was a horrific year. Of course, none of this was solely due to the COVID-19 crisis, but it was certainly influenced by it. And for leaders, scientists, civil society, including naturalists and indigenous people trying to protect nature, ecosystems, and local lifestyles, it's been very challenging. Many conservation activities in the field were curtailed, delayed, or halted due to the challenges that people have faced. Many people in rich nations have had to deal with the challenges of remote work, from offices quickly pulled together in your living room, your kitchen, or other spaces around. Staff of conservation organizations have had to isolate or work in a socially distanced manner, which is not always efficient or even possible. And fundraising activities for many organizations have been severely impacted, despite ongoing costs like staff salaries, rent, or other costs having to continue. So fundraising has had to go online, which is not easy, and in some cases, for organizations in remote places, not even possible. And many donors, supporters, or the public shifted their focus on the pandemic, on the crisis, and on many other priorities, and much more on local issues. And then on top of that, we've seen waste, the plastics and the disposable personal protective equipment that have added to the mountains of waste that end up in landfill and in the ocean. So it's been a very, very challenging year. But at the same time, we've seen some very important and positive shifts in people's understanding and awareness, shifts that FFI has played a key role in driving. There's been a greater awareness, I believe, of the interconnectedness of humanity with the natural world, that we're part of that world and that we both impact it and it impacts us. The pandemic was a result of encroachment into the natural world and our destruction of natural habitats and species that can lead to such spillover events. And the threat of trade in animals, whether it's legal or illegal, has a huge potential impact. It requires care and it requires respect for the natural world. But at the same time, the drop in travel and greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector has led to people developing creative and interesting ways of staying connected, interacting, and listening to diverse voices. And people really stopped to notice the beauty of nature and the quiet that surrounded us with the drop-in cars and travel and noise. It's enabled people to hear birdsong and to hear the sound of nature and appreciate it in a way that perhaps they hadn't before. So throughout this year, despite all the challenges, there have been incredible conservation achievements, and some of these will be highlighted today by our speakers. There have also been some significant learnings that will help us moving forward. One concrete example of that is the role of nature-based tourism in bringing income to communities to enable them to develop sustainable livelihoods. Tourism is often touted as the solution, and people have not looked much further than tourism as a way to find alternative incomes for communities who value and want to protect their nature. But tourism is a very dangerous activity if it's not carried out well, and it can introduce new threats to vulnerable ecosystems. And tourism is also vulnerable to all sorts of forces that can disrupt international travel. So people need to be creative and look at other alternatives. And this year pushed them to do that and to be creative. So the pandemic has enabled strong Indigenous leadership to emerge with creative ideas that are rooted in culture and values that are local. And this is the future for conservation. And this is the strength and the unique approach of FFI. If the world wants to build back better, this is how it will be built, by rooting the work in the rights, the needs, and the strength of local people. So I'd like to introduce now our first speaker, Joanna Elliot, who is the Senior Conservation Director for Cross-Cutting Partnerships at FFI. And she's in charge of the partnerships of conservation finance and enterprise, extractives and infrastructure, and agricultural landscapes, science and design, and capacity and leadership. Joanna is an economist with an MBA from the London Business School, and she spent the first part of her career as a corporate banker and strategy consultant before she decided that these skills were much more suited for the environmental sector. So we're very lucky to have Joanna with us now at FFI and to work on cross-cutting partnerships. So Joanna, I'm going to hand the floor to you.
Thanks, Annette. Hello, everyone. I'll add my welcome to Annette and to those of everyone I think around. Sorry we can't all see each other, but we look forward to getting your questions and thoughts and comments on the chat box as you listen and reflect yourselves on what 2021 holds for the conservation space. I'm going to flick through some comments and thoughts that I hope will inspire but also challenge us as we think about what our priorities are going forwards. Could you put thank you very much. So the question I'm going to be looking at for the next 10 minutes or so is really, can we make 2021 a turning point? What is it going to take for this to feel really different? Next slide, please. So building on what Annette has said in terms of that overview of the difficulties, the challenges, and the almost the trauma of the last 10 months, I'm going to focus very much on where nature finds itself amidst that picture. So I just want to focus a little bit on what's happened until now before I look forward. So just some thoughts from my perspective, some illustrations about some of the things that sort of opened up chinks in the light, in the walls of the tunnel as we crept through the last period. And I'm looking at quite a macro scale here before going down into this local level. So just a few highlights that will be familiar to some of you, but possibly not to all. So from a government perspective, what we saw last year at the UN summit in September at the General Assembly was the launch of a Leaders' Pledge for Nature. And this is a commitment to reverse nature loss by 2030, signed by 83 heads of state, and provides a framework of positive it's a pledge, as it says. It's a positive statement about where people see the priorities. So as we go into 2021, that feels like a really valuable thing to have on our doorstep. Secondly, the US coming back into the Paris Agreement as of earlier this week. It gives us it could have been so different if something else had happened last December. This feels like a real opportunity to recreate a race for the top rather than a race to the bottom as we go through this year towards the Glasgow meeting. From a UK government point of view, the announcement of the 3 billion earmark for nature that was made at the One Planet Summit, that is we like to think FFI's had quite a strong, well, has certainly had a voice in bringing that to fruition. And alongside that, there is a programme of UK government commitment to international environmental progress that we hope we will see real action in December on. But in the meantime, there has been various announcements. For example, the announcement of an end to export financing of new fossil fuel investment. Though, of course, since that announcement was firmly made, it now seems to have gone back out for consultation again. So we would ask the government to hold very tightly to that. But this is, from a government point of view, we see encouraging signs through the pandemic for nature. If we look at the business and finance sectors, what we've seen over the last 10 months is a real flurry of commitment by large corporates to their net zero pathways, and to possibly to a lesser extent, but for some of them, to nature positive operations, all of which are potentially really encouraging. From the financing side, we see that 70% of investment funds are now in ESG, or environmental, social and governance safeguarded funds, which is a huge mark. I mean, again, we would say nature isn't properly represented as yet in those standards. But there are opportunities to strengthen that. And also $150 trillion of investment funds now committed to the net zero pathway. And then a third example, the Carney-led Task Force on Climate Risk Financial Disclosures, now adopted by the UK government, and with an intended rollout to the G20 when it meets in Italy later this year in the autumn. And now with a nature disclosure task force set up and newly at work to try and do the same for nature. But a couple of thoughts to add into this process. What we're needing to see, as we've been reminded recently in the Carney lectures, is a real societal, arrow, a task, a commitment, a guiding framework for all of this to fall into. And what actually we get is all of these commitments, if we add them up, if all of these commitments made so far were to be delivered, it only gets us halfway to the 1.5 degrees. And hence you get comments like Greta's last week, for those of you who are following the One Planet Summit on Twitter, where her only reaction to the speeches by 30 heads of state on their new formed commitments to nature and climate was blah, 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 nature, blah, 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 hope, blah, 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 intervention, and so on. And there is the risk of, amidst all of these, this good framing, there is a risk of inaction and dissatisfaction with progress if we can't all come together and change these commitments into actions on the ground. Next slide, please. So as we carry forward the super year for nature into 2021 after the huge disappointments of 2020, we are actually facing more uncertainty, particularly with regards to the format that these meetings are going to take, but also what's, in some cases, whether or not they'll happen at all, and in other cases, the timing of them. So we're seeing pushback, pushback, pushback. So for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Conference of Parties meeting in Kunming, meant to be last year, now meant to be May this year. It will definitely be postponed again. Huge issues there, partly because there is no consensus from among the parties as to whether they would be willing to meet remotely to discuss the next 10 years of indicators and targets for biodiversity, those terribly important markers. The World Economic Forum's annual meeting, usually January in Davos, now purported to be end of May in Singapore. Again, not clear that there will be the same opportunities for civil society voices to come and speak in the various fora that we would normally be expecting to. FFI's attended the most recent annual meetings, and we've made a significant contribution, I think, to joining up the nature climate debate in various ways. And I think, we will miss the opportunity possibly this year if we can't continue that dialogue. The World Conservation Congress in Marseille happens every 3 years, again delayed from last year to January, now delayed to September, will definitely be going ahead, but probably largely or wholly remotely, followed by the UN General Assembly. And then the only one that at the moment is looking pretty certain is the climate meeting in November, probably looking pretty certain because it's so far away, no one's thought yet that they might need to postpone it. But anyway, I'll talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, please. So what is it we need from these global meetings? What's the framing that we FFI needs for our operations for 2021? Well, we do need that post-2020 biodiversity framework to be agreed and for it to be in place, with regards to particularly indicators and targets that can be then rolled down into national frameworks, but also rolled out into other commitments like the climate commitments. And two particular concerns there, as most of you will probably be familiar, the Convention on Biological Diversity has no teeth. There's no compliance mechanisms in there. It is about voluntary compliance, and there's sadly rather a long history of missing its goals, like the Aichi target, many of the Aichi targets, but also possibly a bigger challenge or a parallel challenge is as well the financing of the work to be delivered under the CBD. And that's something I'll come to in a bit. There is a widely acknowledged and measured significant funding gap for delivering nature conservation. Secondly, and one I'm working closely on with a team in FFI, is looking at what Paris Agreement's going to do for nature. So the whole question of nature-based solutions, nature offsets, and the legality of them as a mechanism in emerging compliance markets for carbon, but also in just ensuring we've got the high quality carbon supply into the voluntary markets maintained. This year is going to be a year of really negotiating these mechanisms. And there's an awful lot of really good brains at work as we speak, trying to figure out what the right way is of doing this in order to both get full decarbonisation of fossil fuels, but at the same time, that worthy investment in nature that's needed, and to make sure that those are not traded off against one another, but are still optimised to bring back planetary health. And there's a lot that's rolling on that's dependent on that being resolved over the next few months. And then thirdly, the commitment to nature positive, we really need to see these commitments turned into action plans, and action plans that are transparent and that we can hold companies to and their financiers to. We need really clear earmarks in there for how these are going to benefit nature. And of course, there is a very strong awareness of what the risk is of failing to do any of these things. And I'll just give you one illustration, which will be familiar to many of you. Can I have the next slide, please? So this will probably be familiar to many of you, but for those who don't know this is the annual overall risk assessment published by the World Economic Forum. It is taken from a survey of business leaders, essentially. And what we've seen, so what you've got is each of the diamonds in the box representing a type of risk. The green diamonds are the environmental risks. The x-axis is the perceived likelihood of these risks happening, and the y-axis is the potential impact if they then do happen. And what we've seen over the last 5 years is a very rapid migration of those green diamonds from the bottom left-hand box to the top right-hand box, and a required extrapolation in both axes to accommodate quite the scale of risk that is now perceived. So this is the context in which all of these discussions are happening, and in which we as FFI are trying to deliver our actions on the ground and the commensurate policy influencing framing that needs to come in behind those actions, but to be fed by those actions in order to really make a difference. Can I have the next slide, please? So just 3 slides now on what FFI's ambitions for 2021 are. And this will by no means capture them all, because in fact, I'm putting 95% of our ambition into that first sentence there, which says impact. So I'm hoping that as this series of webinars unrolls, you're all going to get an opportunity to hear a lot more about our wonderful program of conservation work across the world, across 40 countries, and really delivering impact. I mean, what's been impressive over the last year is, the fact that the effective ban on inter-country travel has not prevented implementation of conservation programs. It's caused a lot of problems for partners, which I'll go on to in a minute. But from an FFI point of view, we have been encouraged, comforted, and we are now motivated by the sort of positive approach that the people working with us and our staff are able to take to delivering our programs across the world. And we've got huge ambitions for expanding that and growing that, as is reflected in our strategy and our financing plans for 2021 and beyond. So lots more on that to come, but that's not what I'm focusing on today. So let me quickly mention this work on, no, go back one, sorry, I'm just still on climate nature links. So I just wanted to mention this because it's so relevant to the big context that I was talking about before. So we have got this year a really strong ambition building up to Glasgow, but also beyond. I mean, Glasgow will be the very first step in a long process of establishing all the right mechanisms. But we really do want to influence the way in which nature is being injected into climate mechanisms. We really do want to ensure that climate finance is pulled down into our on-the-ground projects. And we really, I think one of the terms we really want to introduce into the whole discussion is this idea of legacy carbon. It's the carbon that we protect in the ground that will never come into the market, and yet is absolutely vital as a core contributor to mitigating climate and to enabling both natural systems, but also people to adapt to climate. So it's that idea of legacy carbon we really want to bring strongly into this, this framing of climate nature linkages. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk now just about 2 specific initiatives FFI is really working on hard for 2021. These are top priorities. And I think Estrela in the next presentation will illustrate to you why these initiatives are so important to our partner organizations as well. So the first one is the Ffi Crisis Fund. When the crisis hit last year, we thought FFI would potentially face huge financial challenges as well as our partner organizations. In the end, we were incredibly fortunate that our donors stuck with us. In fact, we ended up having, from an FFI point of view, we sort of hit our budget for the year, quite by, by careful design, I'm sure, but also through very good luck and the commitment of our donors to keeping FFI really, well positioned to have the impact that everyone wants us to have. But what was quickly apparent was the same was not true for our partner organizations. So from the moment the world started to shut down, the impacts on our partners in terms of the threat to health, the inability to travel, but particularly the fragility of income streams. As Annette says, the reliance on tourism was significant, and in sub-Saharan Africa, and for some of our partner systems, it was wholesome. That it was a complete reliance, and tourism shut down almost immediately. And the loss, I believe the loss to African tourism was in the order of $27 billion worth of income last year alone. It was massive. And we quickly recognized that our partners were going to need urgent assistance just to stay afloat before they could even move to planning for how to deal with crisis. And we were lucky we had great donors who came in behind us and lots of individual givers who gave us funds that we were then able, through a very simple mechanism, to disperse to partners, to more than 30 partners across 20 countries, which really helped just bridge that urgent gap between you know, finding out there was a problem and actually remembering to breathe. It was that kind of function. And our aim for this year, of course, the crisis hasn't gone away. I think at the time last year, we were all thinking perhaps by 2021, things would be looking different, but improving. And in fact, that is what's happening. We all remain very optimistic, I think, for what's going to come. But I think what we're facing is a, you know, economic system that has changed structurally. We're facing political systems under great change. Our partners are therefore facing a different form of crisis. This is, you know, the pandemic continues, but there's also a general sense of needing to just be better able to cope with uncertainty. Uncertainty is going to remain, however quickly the vaccination program can be rolled out. And there's a huge recognition of the need for those who were tourism dependent to really diversify and secure income sources. So the long and the short of it is we're really intent on building out what was last year the Crisis Fund into the same thing, but it will be called a Crisis Resilience Fund, aiming to support partners really establish that internal capacity, those strategies, the access to funding that will allow for a move from fragility into resilience over the next 12 months or so. So this is one of our priorities for 2021. And last slide, please. And the other initiative I really wanted to bring to your attention, for those of you who haven't been involved, but also for those who have, is at the UN General Assembly last September, alongside that Leaders Pledge, FFI and our partner organisations submitted a letter to the Secretary General under the title of the Our One Home campaign. And this letter, with 125 partner signatures, just to start with, essentially calls for the UN to help mobilise an additional $500 billion per annum of funding to fill that post-2020 biodiversity framework conservation financing gap. And in particular, and as for those of you who have seen David Attenborough's clip about Our One Home, that what he really draws our attention to, and what really sparked interest for him, was this point that we made strongly, that this funding needs to be increasingly channeled through to local initiatives. And that includes local government, but really pulling it down through the global system, through governments, through corporates, through philanthropists, down to where impact is really felt, which is at local level. And we're now, as FFI and our partners, formulating quite an ambitious strategy and manifesto for 2021 and beyond to really influence governments, corporates, and the philanthropy sector to deliver on this funding pledge. And I think a lot of the data that went into our analysis of the Our One Home campaign came from the Paulson report. And for those of you who have read it, you will remember that there is a clear identification. You know, this looks like a huge amount of funding, but as in that report, it was identified that just addressing the question of fuel subsidies alone would be sufficient to secure a significant chunk of that funding, if not all of it. So we really want to change the narrative on the role that nature is playing and the priority for nature as a means to both mitigate climate, but also to restore general well-being for all people everywhere. That's our intent. And on that note, I'll hand back to Annette to introduce our last speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you also for the thinking big and giving us a holistic overview that integrates human needs with climate, with species conservation and landscape protection, and political and economic priorities that we see around the globe. What it also illustrates, and what you've highlighted for us, is the ambition that's required, the need to really think not just about local initiatives, but linking those local initiatives together and thinking really big and changing the way we live on this planet. But all of that work, in order for it to become a reality, it needs to translate to concrete actions on the ground at the very local scale. And so I'm excited to introduce Estrela Matilde. Estrela is a conservation biologist who is the executive director of Fundação Príncipe. She's lived on Príncipe's island for the past 8 years, managing the Fundação since 2018 and crashing FFI's Christmas parties ever since. Fundação Príncipe is a local NGO based on Príncipe Island, and it works to promote the conservation of the local biodiversity, but in a really community-based strategy and an approach that integrates and supports the development of alternative livelihoods for the local people to improve their societal and economic development of these communities. Fundação's partnership with FFI dates back to 2015, and it's evolved from a consultancy, but now FFI is the main partner supporting the development of the conservation strategy and the implementation of the projects. So Estrela, welcome, and thank you. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Annette, and thank you again for this opportunity. It is a pleasure to be here sharing with all of you a little bit about our island and our organization. And I'm going to be speaking with you about how this global pandemic impacted our small islands and how relevant were all these FFI initiatives, the Crisis Fund and the Protect Our Home initiative, as Joe speak about it. And I could be talking about Príncipe for hours and without success explaining how special our island is. So I'm going to just show you a little bit video so you can have a little peek of how lucky we are to be able to live and work on Príncipe Island before I start the presentation.
A minha ilha é pequena, mas é grande. Um ecossistema diferente, onde não faltam lugares únicos para explorar. Pedaços de terra vigiados pelo mar que ainda ninguém descobriu. É aqui que a biosfera se faz sentir onde quer que estejas. Onde somos parte da grande pegada da natureza. Filhos de uma terra intocada, onde tudo é vivo, onde tudo é verde. Na minha ilha, o pulmão é cheio de ar. As árvores abraçam-nos, as sombras protegem-nos. Na minha ilha, as pessoas são quentes e amáveis. Abrimos novos caminhos todos os dias. Guiamos quem chega, guiamos-nos juntos entre nós. Somos livres e felizes. Somos mistura do café e cacau, do salgado e do doce. Filhos da terra com cheiro à floresta, sabor à fruta e a mar. Na minha ilha, tudo é natural, tudo é puro, tudo é verdadeiro. A minha ilha é única. Tudo que tem só existe aqui. Na minha ilha toda a gente tem um sonho. Leve, leve. Aqui somos todos príncipes. Eu sou do Príncipe.
Thank you so much. I hope you like it, and that when all this ends, you all can visit us here, because it's actually, you know, it's all this and much more. And we are very blessed to be able to work here with all these people. And during this 2020 year, that was a strange and difficult year for the whole planet, for Fundação and for Príncipe, we were lucky that we didn't suffer from the pandemic directly, because our team did not get ill, and we actually only had 30 cases in the beginning of the pandemic, and then we managed to isolate and deal with that very easily, very good, and we had 7 months until the end of the year without any cases. So we were living in the truly paradise, where it looks like the pandemic is something that's happening just far away. However, we suffered very quickly and very heavily all the indirect impacts of the pandemic, and the fact that we are an isolated island, in a one way protected from that, but in the other way make us much more vulnerable to all these indirect impacts. Can you change, please? So from this 2020 and the impacts we have, I think, as Annette also spoke about it, one of the major things that happened was the collapse of the tourism. The tourism business stopped and people were out of work. And what we understood here is that this impacted mainly the young generation, because they were the more dependent on the tourism as the only income. Unlikely their parents and grandparents' generation that use the local resources and have income more related, like fisheries and agricultures. This young generation were working as guides and in the hotels, so they were the one that get more impacted by the hotels being closed and the collapse of tourism. And also that the whole market and the whole economy was 100% organized to support the hotels' needs in terms of fishing and in terms of agricultures. The hotels were who controlled the whole market. We saw with their close up that there was a reduction on exportation of dried and salt fish, and consequently there was an excess of fresh fish in the local markets. And these obviously make the prices go down, but despite the prices of fish becoming cheaper, the reduction on people's income make them unable to buy it more. So actually it was a negative consequences in that sense, even if the prices were was lower. In terms of agriculture, there was a lack of demand from the local hotels, so they stopped the whole production because the demand locally is very low. And the lack of transport between the islands. For you to have an idea, so Príncipe is a small island, and we have the main island that is São Tomé, and the majority of our goods and resources like fuel for energy that all come from São Tomé, and the boats only come when they are full. And when we have these 5 or 6 hotels putting a lot of goods in the boats, they come regularly. Without that demands, the boats don't come because there is no goods, there is nobody buying it. So we spent weeks again without that transportation as well. The transportation also stopped because of the COVID, but not only that, the demand of products was really low. So that impacted all the local economy in terms not only having goods on the island, but also exporting. And we managed to understand how important it was for the fishery communities that we work with in terms of the fish traders. They used to, so the main business is to buy fish, salt, dry the fish, and then export to São Tomé. And with this lack of boats that stopped, and they also, the lack of income, they don't have a way of buying salt, so they stopped salting fish. So they just buy fresh fish, and then there was an extended of fresh fish on the island also because the demand was very low. So there was a return to the exchange economy that happened, a return to the old practices. And what we saw as well was that this young generation that were working in the hotels, they start doing the business that their parents and grandparents did, like fishermen, fish and also agriculture, but they become non-professional fishermen and non-professional agricultures because they don't have knowledge, they don't have training, they don't have the experience for it. So we have now an excess of this kind of professions, so an impact on the resources and a demand on the resources, and not in a sustainable way because they don't have the knowledge and the experience to do it. So the island becoming, we are an autonomous region, we suffer for the double insularity, and all that was highlighted during this pandemic. Especially, we always suffer this, but now the pandemic highlighted everything. You can change, please. But all this learning process was a lot of food for our thoughts, for our projects, for our initiatives. We learn how important it is to understand really how the value chain work, and was good to understand the community vulnerability. And one thing we learned, actually we didn't learn because we knew it, but was really clear how resilient the communities are, how well they deal with this whole situation, and how well they adapt to the new reality better than we do. So it was amazing to see that happen, how there was an exchange on the market, an exchange on the profession, how they went to look for incomes that they didn't have before. And some of this learning process that we went through last year is really relevant for our projects. Like we had this assumption that there is fishing communities, there is agriculture communities, and that is actually not true. We have the fishing communities have fishermen, but also have people doing agriculture, the same as the agriculture communities have people fishing. So that is when we implement projects with the fishing communities, we actually now have to start thinking, wait, because the agricultural communities also have fishermen, so we have to work with them as well. So that made us realize some of our assumptions were not as correct, and was a very important learning process for us. And also, as we be talking about the tourism, it is very important, the tourism as a conservation tool. As Annette said, we had several of our projects and initiatives based on the tourism as a tool. The whole island, the strategy of the government to the development of the island is through the tourism, sustainable and responsible tourism, trying to have a tourism with the less impact possible. And Príncipe is being marketed for this kind is expensive place where we want the tourism to come with the right mindset. And we working with our conservation projects with the communities, trying to find alternative livelihoods and diversify approaches. And we did put the tourism as one of the tools and one of the main ones. Like we have fishing communities working to produce handicraft for tourism as an alternative livelihoods, other communities producing soap as an alternative livelihoods to reduce the pressure on the natural resources. And obviously with the tourism, all that income that these initiatives were hoping to get, it all stopped. And what was interesting to see is this resilience that is amazing, is that these own groups, they start finding alternatives. So like the soap group that was producing soap and having agreements with the hotels, they start producing mats because that is a local demand. So they shift the productions they have, they maintain the structure that we create under our projects, but they shift the products they were producing for the local demands. And that was amazing to see. So it is true that the tourism is an important tool, and we want to work with the tourism and to the right kind of tourism, but this is a fragile tool as well. So nobody thought this might happen, and this was a learning process for us that, okay, we need to find alternatives to the tourism. So we need to find sustainable local alternatives for these initiatives to go through as well. And that, yes, we can survive without the tourism. We can survive locally and having this exchange chain of markets, and we have enough for the people to survive on the island. But we understood as well, and we learned as well, that while the species and habitats focused projects are an important part of the overall conservation approach we have on the island, it is more than ever critical to engage the local people in the conservation and in the design and delivery of integrated conservation projects, which they seek to do conservation biodiversity alongside meeting the needs of local people. That is essential to have the conservation being successful. And that can be done through a variety of the ways, diversifying their livelihoods and promoting more sustainable livelihoods approach. And especially here, the learning point is diversifying, not just focus and, in one tool. And again, that people are really resilient, and a very positive thing was that even despite the problems, the COVID situation and the income reduction, people were still keen to work with us, to answer our query, to work with conservation. So that didn't change. So that was amazing to see that happen. So we want to have, and you can change please, Laura, we want to have a hands-on approach for the conservation. And 2021, we are really excited and positive about it. We feel that Príncipe can be a live laboratory because we are so privileged. We have 80,000 people, and we can see directly the impacts of our conservation projects in situ and very quickly. And we can show that it's possible to find this balance between protecting biodiversity and also find the sustainable economic development of the communities. It's possible to do that. So Príncipe, we are privileged. We can we can understand, implement, test, replicate in the rest of the world, so we can work as a laboratory. And the opportunity from FFI with the Crisis Fund and the Protect Our Own initiative as well, this was fantastic because we could improve our knowledge about the value change, to change some preconceived ideas we had that will improve so much our projects and our success. We understand now that we need a much more deep analysis on the value change, and that with this knowledge, we can actually implement business models that will ensure this non-dependence on only one resource, in this case, tourism, and that we can find economic sustainability of the communities locally. And this fund allow it also, and one important bit is obviously the flag species and the more fragile species are the ones that suffer when this kind of crisis happen. And one of our concerns was with the marine turtles, as we know that in situations of crisis, we go to this resource that is easier to catch and is money easy to get, and will be the species that will suffer a lot. And with these funds from FFI, this allows us to reduce that pressure on the marine turtle, because we increase the patrols, we increase the monitoring of the beaches and of the sea, and we could keep working with the communities, having focal points in each one of them, and making them not forgetting conservation, not forgetting the importance of still protecting our resources. At the same time, working with them, okay, we don't have tourism now, how can we make this work, and how can we make, find local solutions as well. So this was all, I think, COVID was a learning opportunity. The FFI allow us to implement a series of initiatives that could make sure that all the work we did before was not ruined by economic demands that was happening. We even having lost the majority tool that is the tourism, there was also an opportunity to think outside the box. So I think this was the most learning process of all this. We're running out of time, sorry. Let's go the last slide, please. So what we learned is, can you go to the last one, please? That we as an island, as a live laboratory, we need to think as a village we are, isolated from the world, because we are insulated, and in this kind of crisis that's where it's more obvious, but we can be sustainable and self-sufficient without harming the local biodiversity, and we can have strategies not only to survive but to thrive on our own. We want to attract tourism and want that to be an extra income and an extra benefit for the local communities, ensuring obviously that the negative impacts they are reduced, but we don't want them to be dependent on that only one resources. So the tourism can be the cherry in the top of the sustainable cake, but not the whole cover. Without the cherry, the cake is still tasty, and that's what we want to happen on the island. So thank you very much, and let me know if you have any other question. It was a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Estrela. That was just wonderful to hear. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. I'm going to take the one, and then I'm going to hand one each to Estrela and Joanna. One of the question was, what can you offer in terms of optimism? And I would like to just offer that what Estrela discussed and talked to us about was this incredible resilience and the creativity of communities to find locally appropriate solutions to the problems. And I think that's one of the greatest sources of optimism that we have. The solutions do have to come from the ground. They don't come imposed from the top. And I think what Fundação Príncipe has demonstrated is how resilient and how creative and inventive and deeply committed these communities are. What Joanna has also talked about is the increased awareness at the very highest levels and at the global scale of the risk of ignoring nature and of the importance of environmental factors in safeguarding the well-being of humanity. And I think that growing awareness is another cause for optimism. Although it is an awareness based on alarm, it is an awareness that can motivate real behavior change. What I'd like to ask Estrela to answer is, what does the future of ecotourism look like from your perspective? And let me know if you need some time to think about it. Otherwise, I will pass to the next question to Joanna and come back to you.
Okay, no problem. I can share my view. I think we are in a very privileged situation compared to the rest of the world, I think, or to the majority of the places, because the regional government have this gem that is Príncipe, a very special place that we need to protect. And we had this investor that had a lot of money that want to invest on the island in a sustainable way. So he's not here to make money. Is here to make to show the world that it's possible to have a sustainable and developing place while protecting nature. And we are lucky enough as well to have these local communities that they truly are really proud. And this was a work from the regional government. When the government decided to apply with Príncipe to be a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in 2012, they make sure they integrate all the communities, and they all sign saying they want to be a biosphere reserve. And they explain to them, what biosphere reserve is not only a natural park, it's the foods, it's the dancing, it's the people, it's everything. We are all biosphere, and they are so proud of that. So when we work with them with the conservation and we explain to them how important it is to produce our resources, they understand that. When we say to them, look, the turtles, we need to protect them, but look, there is a tourism that come, and you can sell a turtle to a tourism up to 5 times during a season, and if you kill it, you're just going to make money once. So we pick that money from the tourism, and we do a conservation fund, and we distribute that money through the 3 best communities that have best practices. So they understand, but again, there is the weight on tourism, but they understand they can make more money with the turtle alive than dead. Yeah. And here on the island, this is the view, and this is how tourism is going to work. I don't think we have space for and it's not, the island doesn't have capacity for a mass tourism in a non-sustainable way. And even the people don't want that. So when we talk with them, they know that what they can sell is the natural resources. So this is the demand of the community, the demand of the people. They had several projects to come to the islands with huge impacts, like palm oil plantations, and the communities were the one raising the flag and say, we don't want that, we don't want that. So as long as you have the community on board, they are the ones selling. The tourism that we want here is only the ecological communities, tourism, sustainable tourism. And what this all proved to us is that, you know, even if that not happen, we will survive and we are resilient. So we don't need you as much as you thought we need you. I think that was the learning.
Yeah, thank you. Joanna, I know you don't have a lot of time, but would you be able to talk to us a little bit about how FFI prioritizes its choices of conservation projects?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's one we're constantly asking ourselves: is what should our priorities be? I mean, for those of you who know FFI well, you'll know that we commit long term to our partners and to our sites where we're working. So those sorts of decisions are made based on need, what the biodiversity value is, what the opportunity is, the fit to FFI. So we go where we really feel we can help and then help deliver impact long term. That's kind of the fundamental basis on which we prioritize, I would say. That said, we also obviously do an awful lot of influencing and shorter term focused work, and that will again be in the context of the changing environment for nature conservation. So we work very collaboratively. I think one of the things FFI is really well known for is being a really good, effective partner, both to local partners, but also in larger scale collaborations. And some of those are very short term, some of those are long term. We're working in some really important collaborations at the moment. One, for example, is the World Economic Forum Natural Climate Solutions Initiative, which is striving to bring a huge demand number to COP26 that will actually bring nature carbon fully into the markets if it can be shaped in the right way. That will be probably a 12 to 18 month initiative. And we've prioritized it because it fits really well with our local. So perhaps I'll summarize that by saying, as you said earlier, Annette, I think bringing the local and the global together, making sure the local impact is the priority and the measure, but that the global is brought in alongside to, ensure that both work well together.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I think perhaps we have time. Well, actually, we are out of time, so I don't know if we're allowed to ask one more question. But there was a question that I would like to ask, if you could respond quickly, Estrela, which is more about how the local people have adapted to the collapse of tourism on the island, and what alternative income streams you think are available to them. And I know you've touched upon that in your earlier response, but whether or not you could elaborate a little bit.
So they adapt with returning to old practices and going through professions that their parents and grandparents did. So going back to fishing and doing agriculture. So going back to more producing to eat and not as much to sell. So the island return a little bit to this exchange market of products, not necessarily economic market, but to exchange goods between them. And also, alternatives, as we saw that happening with some of the initiatives we have, is they stopped the production that were more based on the tourism income, and they start producing things that were locally needs, like the soap. They start producing the mats. So the needs are much reduced, because they are producing to survive, and they'll exchange with each other what they need, and then they can have some extra incomes with things that are needed locally, and they very quickly shift the mind on we cannot export to São Tomé, we don't have tourism to sell, so what can it's needed here that we can sell. So, and it's also 8,000 people, so it was easy to it is easy to survive here, actually. I don't know if I answered.
No, I think that was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank
you.
Joanna and Estrela for the wonderful presentations today, and thank everybody for attending the webinar and for listening to this conversation about what some of the potential ways forward are in 2021 and onwards, and what the priorities are and what people can do to ensure that conservation remains on top of the agenda. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.